Hey, what up, guys? Colin here. Today we're going to talk about something that you'll probably know a lot about, but don't actually know squat about. That's NATO. So first, let's get into what that is. NATO. So it's an acronym. First off, it stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was created after World War II. Specifically, I believe it was created in 1945 exactly. It was supposed to be a coalition of nations that were made to counter the Soviet Union in preventing it from, say a total takeover of Europe or expanding its power and influence as a communist nation among the rest of the world. All right, so NATO did, a decent job at first. They allowed, or I should say, they ensured that something like West Germany stayed independent of East Germany, that those two did not become reunified as a communist state. They ensured that Austria was not totally taken over by the Soviets, and the Soviets actually gave back their part of Austria, I'll say the early 1950s. They supported the Greeks in the Greek Civil War, preventing a communist takeover. They supported the Chinese in the Chinese Civil War that followed within the later half of the 1940s. I want to say 1946 is when that started. You have Truman doing all these deals to help aid supplies to, or to give supplies to the non-communists, also known as the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek, who then, eventually, fled to Taiwan, and that's modern day Taiwan. But NATO was doing a lot within the beginning, ensuring communism didn't spread, and they did very well at it, despite all the wars that we were in the Cold War. There was a pretty contained apparatus of the Red Threat. So who made up NATO originally? Well, obviously the United States. Then you got the UK, you have France, you have West Germany, later Germany. You got a bunch of other states within Europe, like the Italians. You got you got the Danes. You got the Norwegians. You got the Dutch, the Belgians, et cetera, et cetera. You have most of the Western European powers or even nations. However, it was not necessarily a steady alliance. U.S. was the most powerful nation out of all the nations within that. Of course, we had just gotten out of a war, which most of these other countries were destroyed and ruined. So France, the other actual power within this alliance, during the 50s, starts getting, frustrated that it's becoming a American-dominated coalition, as it's supposed to be like a partner group between all these nations to aid and protect each other. When in reality, it becomes what this popular phrase notates it as: Americans in, Germans down, Russians out. That's essentially what NATO acts as during its early days, and that's how it acts even nowadays, with how it orients itself towards politics within the world. So NATO, they're fighting on a large scale wars against communist countries or countries who are having civil wars to become communist. They're supporting the non-communist sides. This keeps going on throughout the Cold War era until you get to the fall of the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union falls, you think, well, there you go. NATO won. What's the point for them existing anymore? All they were there for was to contain and deter a Soviet threat amongst the nations. The Warsaw Pact is destroyed. All those nations that were previously under the yoke of communism from the Soviets is bereft of that yoke. Sure, China is still a communist state, but the Russians are no longer under the Red Menace. So you think, well, clemency could be allowed, friendly terms, trade, whatever might happen after an enemy is no longer an enemy. However, let's just say there's a lot of infiltration and false hands in key positions. For example, when Richard Nixon was the president of the United States, he made a deal at the so-called Minsk Accords with, I believe it was Khrushchev, maybe it's Gorbachev, but I believe it was Khrushchev, about not one step east. NATO would not take one step east into, Soviet satellite states if they were given independence or, allowed to be free from the Soviets. For a short period of time, that was the case. And the Soviet Union falls. Almost immediately, Poland joins NATO. Almost immediately, you have some of the larger members of these Soviet republics joining NATO. Hold on, wait a second. I thought the Americans agreed they would not expand NATO. That's true, they did at one point. However, they're no longer bound to that because the entity which they made that deal with doesn't exist. So, why would you honor your word when not honoring your word, not being trustworthy and honorable would get you less influence than being deceitful and taking advantage of others, getting us to where we are today, or to where we were within the late 90s, early 2000s, more specifically. How NATO was essentially pushed all the way east and up to, but not including Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, obviously, and then Yugoslavia, notably, were holdouts against the NATO influence. Well, what happened to Yugoslavia? They were broken up because of NATO. You see, this little thing called, or what's supposedly called, ethnic cleansing started within the Yugoslav states because the internal strife among the culture groups there, also religious differences. You had Croats, who were mostly Catholic and tend to be Western in approach to stuff. Serbs, who are Orthodox, and, Serbs are considered the little brothers of Russia, so you could assume how that would go. And then Bosniaks, which are essentially Turkified Slavs, kind of, like they're their own culture, yeah, but like when the Ottoman Empire was within that area, they were the most affected by it, as they're a majority Muslim within the Bosnian state. So yeah, you have three different cultures, three different religions. They start fighting. Tito had died recently, and there's a power vacuum, so they start fighting to prevent each other from asserting themselves on the others and influencing or determining the will of the people. And so the civil war breaks out. The Croatian part goes for a couple of years. They break off. That's completely fine. No NATO intervention. The Serbs and the Bosniaks go out for a little bit. That's fine. For some time, until eventually NATO decides that they have to step in which this is under Bill Clinton, precisely. The U.S. starts bombing and destroying the Serbian state, the ex-Yugoslav state of Serbia, specifically. completely, reversing the outcome of the war and shaping the Balkans within the U.S. imperialistic view. And then what more came out of that? Well, Kosovo, Albania, those also are a cause of the NATO interference within the Balkans. Kosovo, a part of Serbia, which sure, has a decent Albanian population, tried to break away because of a referendum that was held by Albanians who flooded the area. And Serbia said no, they weren't going to allow it. But then, NATO was like, oh, self-determination, you have to allow these people to, live how they desire to, aside from your state, since they do not conform to your state. That's interesting. They did it, NATO forced Kosovo to be allowed to break away from Serbia. And to this day, it's basically just a smaller part of Albania that is not recognized by anyone except for the U.S. and a few other Western countries. Most Asian countries, most European countries do not recognize Kosovo as a legitimate state. But, you have NATO propping it up, and so it's technically considered its own country, which is just awful as it causes more tension each day that it exists on the map. But enough of the Southern European part of this. NATO, as you know, nowadays, its job has more or less stayed the same. It's to contain Russia, to counter Russia, because I'm sure most of you have heard the term for neocons. Neocons are deathly afraid of an actual adversary, which they think does not and cannot exist within the world. They'll tell you about the boogeyman of the Soviet Union and that Russia is exactly its successor, or that the Chinese are out to get you and they want to, destroy you and take over the country. When in reality, it's just scare tactics for the power base of NATO, America, to continue to do its job of policing or enforcing its will upon the world. And so, within the current time, we have NATO trying to incorporate Ukraine into the alliance. Earlier later within 2023, you have people like Sweden, Finland joining NATO, late 23, early 24 maybe. One time when I was on a underway for my job, we had, a special visitor from a foreign country, and he was there because his country was interested in joining NATO, supposedly, because, Russia is a threat, and he's afraid of what might happen. And so, dignitaries met with the military, and then all of a sudden, Finland is in NATO. Do they like how it's affected them? No. No, apparently, according to the state of the Finnish leadership, they do not like the outcome that has been forced upon them now that they are technically a hostile state to Russia. Because you can best believe this whole Ukrainian-Russian war that's going on, or to accurately call it the special military operation that Russia's conducting, is essentially just a fight against NATO. So you have, anyone who is in NATO automatically has a lesser opinion from the Russian Federation because of the threat that they pose for an invasion of these larger Western powers that are part of NATO, like, the UK, US, who are the main proponents of the Anglosphere, which many people have forgotten about being a thing, but I'd like to believe that NATO is technically just a continuation of the Anglosphere, as those are the two biggest proponents of its power base, and they're the two most active nations when it comes to this global alliance, as are the former crown states of the the British Commonwealth, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, such, especially Australia, always helping out in every single war that the U.S. has been in, like actually the greatest ally that America has ever had, not like the fake ally of Israel. But yeah, so there's that. But this special military operation that's been going on has just showed that NATO is a puffed up, weak entity, essentially a paper tiger, and that is old and outdated within its place in the world. And yet, still within America, people see it as a legitimate entity or a actual method of exerting influence in a positive way, despite the repercussions that come out of using such a organization. The French, who notably left NATO in the, like to say, early 60s because of the obvious American oversight, the French have notably been trying to form their own party globally as a diplomatic power to counter the NATO influence within Europe, specifically within Europe, that is. Even though they still tend to go along with the plays that the NATO member states take when it comes to non-Western countries, such as their support for their support for Zelensky and his government within Ukraine. The French, in spring of 2024, even put out a statement that they would put ground forces within Romania to try and provide actual military support to the Ukrainians. Obviously, that never happened, which is a good thing for them. But it shows the effect that states who are not beholden to such an entity still play within its web. And so we've seen all these member states pledging arms, tanks, munitions to the failed state of Ukraine, and how they've been essentially killing the Ukrainian men and destroying their country because of their greed as an organization to be against Russia. And so what does that mean, really? Well, obviously, it's a battleground that is going on still. This special military operation has been not going so well for the NATO imperialists. Or, no, not imperialists. Perhaps NATO extortionists. And they are obviously losing with the military supply or the munitions and armor reserves of these nations being depleted. Obviously, of all the older stuff first, but even newer weapons or wonder weapons being not available for their own countries, such as Leopard A2s within Germany, and whatever the main battle tank for the UK is. They've notably given up almost all of theirs, as well as the United States giving up F-16s, F-35s, top of the line jets that cost the Americans millions per one to be built, going to a cause that they have no vested interest in and that will not have any returns for the people. And so NATO is essentially just a way of creating wars in the world without the U.S. government needing to declare war, because the U.S. government is not really wanted to have any wars going on because of the people's adherence, or rather lack of adherence, to a war. NATO has played a key role within the Middle East in these U.S. wars over the past 20 years, such as the invasion of Iraq, Afghanistan, the Syrian civil war, the Yemeni civil war, so on and so forth. And it's really just been a way to increase NATO's foothold as a barrier against the Eastern countries and Russia. So why do people support NATO? Why would the average American support it? Well, I'd like to believe that most Americans do not support it. In reality, a lot of people might support it because they think that other nations actually are a threat. They don't realize the weight of power of arms. There's not really any wars that go on nowadays within the European world, the Western world more specifically. And so they do not understand that, if we were to actually have a real war, not like attacking people with a non-cohesive army, that it would not go well for us. And a lot of younger people who, watch independent media or they do their own research are seeing this within the special military operation within Ukraine. But a lot of the older generation, such as boomers and others who are adamantly attached to their news sources like, Fox, CNN, Reuters, MSNBC, you name it, big organizations that are news outlets. They just don't really understand the picture of how stuff really is. And so it allows such corrupt organizations to still exist and really affect the lives of everyday people. So that's about it. NATO is a overindulged state within its power. It has no actual power to conduct military operations. It really just has the power of threats from the U.S. government. And so it needs to be, done away with, ended. No more NATO. No more foreign wars. How'd you like to see that on a ballot? Support America. Support Americans. Don't send over billions of dollars to a foreign country that couldn't care less about you, or it's going to do nothing for you because you're sitting at home, unable to afford a home, or you're not able to buy food, or you don't even have a job because of how awful stuff is here. Or even more, your family just lost everything because of a flood from a hurricane within Tennessee and North Carolina and many other southern states, but your government is too focused on doing what exactly? Using the money for foreign interests. And I'm not going to say that NATO is the prime source of these foreign interests or the foreign expenditure, but it is one of the biggest ones because it is essentially the military industrial complex at work. And so it should, be stopped. Stop allowing America to be tricked or sold to the highest bidder simply to further a cause that has no real or rather no real end. Russia is its own country and should be allowed to exist as its own country that can exert its will and power just as any other country should be allowed to do. And there's no reason for a coalition of nations to fight against another nation that they have nothing to do with within its realm of influence, within its politics, within its history. It's just wrong. All right. Bye.